So for the next hour, we've set ourselves the modest task of a session on the art of 1.6 billion people over 1,500 years. An easy and effortless subject to canter through. What we're going to do is, in the next hour or so, try to give some impression of the sheer diversity across both time and space of the arts of Islam. We're going to range across continents, we're going to range across time, and we're going to have all the specialists on this panel each give a short discussion, presentation on their work and area of specialization, which hopefully will cumulatively give an impression of the sheer width and wonder of Islamic art. So we'll start, first of all, with Zulfikar. Perhaps you'd let us know about yourself.
Do you want us to introduce ourselves?
Yes, please.
So, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. I'm Zulfikar Hirji. I'm an associate professor at York University, and I was in Jaipur in February and totally blown away by this amazing, amazing festival, which is put on by some really amazing people, volunteers, and others. I made my way here because of this new book, which I co-authored with Farhad Daftari, who's at the back there, and who's very modest and is very shy, and a wonderful team of people, editors, and so on, and it's our great pleasure to share this with you and some aspects of it which relate to this panel on Islamic art.
Which we should also say are our sponsors, the Ankam Foundation, for which we're very grateful. Okay. Thank you, Matt, wherever you are. Matt, do you hear? Yeah, Matt.
Did you want to be? Okay, so the first thing I wanted to say is that the great intellectual thinker Antonio Gramsci once said that history leaves all sorts of traces on us, but there's no sort of inventory for any of this. There's no kind of orderly guide. And then Edward Said said, well, let's start making new stories. Let's start recreating an inventory that makes sense to us. And so stories, in fact, is the key word for this festival. And in fact, one of the stories that we hear about Islam is its dogmatism, its terrorism, it's somehow retrograde, it's not modern. And when we look at the evidence, such as the evidence I'm going to show you here about the Quran and its arts, we begin to see a very different story. And so the guides that are here today are all going to present these different inventories. And to share with you myself, the Quran has been expressed in many different ways. From the time of its revelation up to the present day, the Quran has actually been one of the greatest and most influential subjects of Islamic art and creative expression and piety, etc. And the slide that you see on the screen there actually shows you the array of different perspectives. The first slice that you see there is from a 7th century Syrian manuscript, what's called a palimpsest, of people just simply writing on a sort of a parchment and then wiping it off and rewriting, and that's why it's called a palimpsest. But that's from Syria from the 7th century, which represents the kind of manuscript tradition. And right next to it is a red 18th century cenotaph cover from Ottoman Turkey, which was used to cover, obviously, a funerary pyre. So next to that is a group of contemporary Malian students writing the Quran into stencils. And next to that, if you can see it barely there, is some...
Can we have the lights down so that we can maybe have a better chance of seeing the screen?
Okay. I would have hoped to describe these to you, but...
These lights, please, down.
So the next to it is a Mamluk glass lamps from the 12th century, which have the enigmatic Surat al-Nur, the verse of light, which talks about Allah as the light of the heavens and the earth, inscribed on it. So quite a kind of a reflection, both in the medium, the utility, and as well as the verse that's written there. And the final one, which may surprise you, is a neon shadow box art piece from Saudi Arabia with the word Allah. The name in Arabic for God. So you can see here, right from the 7th century up to the 21st century, media, expression, different kinds of calligraphic forms, all these different aspects suggest that Islam is and Muslims are not tied to a certain tradition of artistic expression. They're not only about ink and pens, but they can use textiles, they can use stencils, they can use paper, they can use glass, they can use neon. And this is really a remarkable, different story than one would hear in the public domain about Muslims. The next slide I wanted to show you is that diversity continues. So here you have on the left a 20th century calligrapher from China, Haji Noor. This particular piece is in the British Museum, and it takes the Arabic calligraphy but uses Chinese forms, in fact, to represent the 99 names of Allah. And right next to it is a story from the Quran in figural images from the 16th century. And it's a beautiful representation of Adam and Eve and the angels bowing in front of them. So you see that Muslims have not been afraid to use figural images alongside calligraphic compositions. And this kind of story that you get of Muslims are opposed to figural images, well, it is entirely true that some Muslims do not like figural images, but it is not true that all Muslims do not like them. So I think what we're trying to express here in this book...
What is the Quranic or the Hadith which leads to this impression?
So the idea here is that people interpret the Quran as that God is the only creator and one cannot create. But in fact, that is an interpretation, and that's what we find, is that the Quran has many interpreters and many interpretive communities. So when people ground their thinking in the Quran, well, there is the written text of the Quran, but there's a whole interpretive tradition around it, which Muslims make sense of it. So when people ask this kind of question, they often say, well, the Quran says. Well, the Quran says, and I have interpreted it to mean, is the next statement.
Right.
The last little thing there is from a poem from poet Saadi, and he was living during the Mongol invasions, and Shiraz, where he was living, was spared the wrath of the Mongols. And this particular poem, which says, all human beings are members of one frame, since all at first from the same essence came, with time affects a limb, the other limbs at rest cannot remain. If thou feel for others, not for others' misery, a human being is no name for thee. This is, of course, more beautifully rendered in Persian, which I cannot speak. Maybe Sussan could provide us a rendition, or others in your audience. But the important thing here is that literature, along with music, has been interpolated with a lot of Quranic ideas. And in fact, the very first stanza there is absolutely from the Quran, which talks about the fact, there's a Quranic verse, ayah, which talks about the fact that all human beings were created from one soul. And that the idea here, the ethical principle that's derived by Saadi here in literature, is that if that is the case, roll out the ethics of that. You know, think about what that means, that if you are all created from one soul, my pain is your pain, your pain is my pain. So I think that that really gives a sense of the kinds of ways the Quran has been interpolated into other artistic media, literature, music. I have a great friend who works in West Africa, and contemporary music in West Africa is full of Quranic material, and it just requires an ear and thought to recognize that popular culture throughout the world, from the Muslim world, and is full of this kind of Quranic material, although we're not attuned to hearing it. And so when people say that the Quran can only be recited in this particular context, in this particular form, it defies the evidence that we have. And as a historian, as a social anthropologist, I'm always curious to think, well, what's preventing those people from expressing themselves in these ways? Certainly not the ways in which some small group of Muslims think about this. Finally, I'll end with this, is that, of course, one of the important things that we have to recognize is that while we have great contemporary expressions, the historical past of Muslims not only misunderstood, misconceived, misperceived, but it is also being destroyed. And here are Qurans from the vast archives in West Africa, which were, in a sense, destroyed by some Muslim groups as well. This is a good friend of mine, Abdul Qadir Haidara, who is written about in many contemporary newspapers, about someone who actually had a private collection of Quran and other intellectual heritage from West Africa, dating back, in fact, to the 15th century. This particular Quran from Andalusia, written in Maghribi script, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. And he has taken efforts and pains to preserve his family heritage. And I think that was a theme right from the beginning of this, this festival, in which Tristan talked about the fact of how do we think about cultural heritage preservation, things about repatriation, questions of that kind. And the Muslim world is full of heritage that is lost, that is being lost, but is also being preserved. And here are Muslims preserving their own heritage, despite the fact that other Muslims do not feel that this heritage matters. So I'll end with that and transfer it over to Sussan.
Sussan, I think, is going to speak on architectural...
That's right.
Architectural...
Architecture.
Architecture.
Take this massive world of Islam through architecture. May I stand up? Because
Yes,
I can't see my slides. I'm sorry about that.
You can go wherever you like, Sussan. You can...
I can move forward. Are the slides ready?
Do we have the first set of slides? Yeah.
Yeah? Thank you.
Yep.
So what I'd like to do is bring to this discussion what Zulfikar started us with, which is there is more than one Islam, and this multiplicity of Islam or Islams should be taken into consideration, and that Islam fits into a larger community of Abrahamic religions and other religious practices, and therefore shares a great deal with other earlier and then later traditions of faith, essentially. And so in India alone, where there is, or South Asia to be more precise, where the birth of many religions come together with the arrival and reception of religions, we have monuments that spread across the globe through Sanchi, through Dome of the Rock, through Borobudur or the Lotus Temple. What I'd like to do, however, is to take the example of perhaps the place of worship for Muslims across the globe and think about the connected and shared histories and traditions through that, and point to the fact that there are many practices of Islam which allow for people to come together in ways more perhaps more smoothly than we associate with modern day conflicts between, say, Sunnis and Shiites, or Shiites, a variety of branches, or Sunni practices according to different kinds of schools of law and so forth. So I wanted to start with with just a quick view of what is the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, on the platform of Haram al-Sharif, where, for instance, the mosque begins very early on with the Umayyad caliphs, or not even Umayyad caliphs, but one of the first followers of the Prophet, with the Caliph Omar. Then it is built or finished by the Umayyads, the first of a dynastic rule across the globe. That was Islam of the day. Then it is destroyed in an earthquake and then rebuilt by the Fatimids, who are Ismaili Shiites, actually. And this kind of comfort in terms of the significance of a mosque, its importance to be preserved, to be handed down, to be made available to so many different confessional groups, is one of the key elements, underlying factors in these varied practices of Islam. And that sort of shared structures of worship in Islam spreads out from the house mosque of the Prophet in Medina, has one shared notion, which is turning for prayer towards Qibla in Kaaba in Mecca. And so mosques from Mali to Cordoba in southern Spain, from Xi'an in China to Kuala Lumpur of today, in other words, across the globe, this shared notion of an orientation, a spiritual orientation, links them up in ways that are extraordinary, actually, while each of them follow a local, regional tradition in architectural terms, in terms of materials of construction, in terms of decoration, and so forth. But that shared orientation makes these diversities both come through as a kind of a united, if you will, spiritual posture, at the same time that each preserves its own character. So multiplicity of Islams is embedded in all of that, while also that shared notion comes to the fore. And I want to take these shared notions to a particular time, and that is the early modern period. I'm a scholar of art and architecture of the Islamic world, primarily of the early modern period. I teach at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and one of our greatest goals in life as teachers is to bring people, young people, to see the connected histories, to see these shared cultural worlds. And this is not just about Islamic world, but also moving across various other geographies, Europe and East Asia, for instance. And here I want to point to the two cities, the city of Istanbul, which becomes the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and the city of Isfahan, which becomes the capital of the Safavid Empire. One is Sunni, and this is when the divisions begin to take real roots, in the sense that politically motivated divisions between empires begin to emerge, but at the same time that these are competitive worlds, they also share a great deal. They look at each other, they exchange material, they fight and take booty, but also send ambassadors and gifts. In other words, it's much more complex than just a flat-out battles and conflicts and divisions, but rather these culturally enmeshed communities. In both of these environments, as in, for instance, also Delhi and Shah Jahanabad, the city of Shah Jahan, and Isfahan, which share a great deal in 17th century. These are cosmopolitan cities with a variety of people, variety of Muslim practices, but also Christians of all denominations, Jews, and Hindus, obviously, and Buddhists, and so forth, in both of these cities. In fact, in all the three major empires of the Muslim world in this late period, the so-called Gunpowder Empire period. So on that point of common shared knowledge, exchange of information, I also want to bring to the fore what Zulfikar quoted from Gulistan of Sa'di. Persian language becomes the shared language of high culture in these regions, especially from 15th century onwards. And that's a key point. A great deal of the heritage of India, for instance, of South Asia, of Greater Iran, of Central Asia, of Turkey of today is based on this shared Persian language high culture. And what Gulistan of Sa'di quote comes about is actually one that has been put at the opening or in the building of the United Nations in New York as a notion of a linked humanity in a way. This is not to make it rosy. There is a great deal of blood and murder and fight and so forth, but to actually think about those other ones, because our common sort of conceptions today are colored by the political rivalries and the upheavals that we are exposed to more than historical connected and shared cultures. Thank you.
Sussan, do you have the...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So, changing.
We have the next...
So while the slides are loading, I'm Vivek Gupta. I'm a historian of Islamic and South Asian art based at SOAS and at the British Library. And today I'm going to talk to you about some vignettes from my research that sort of shed light on what the status of the practice of Islamic art in South Asia is. And really, I loved how Zulfikar started us off today, because he said something about stories. And really, what attracts me to what I work on is really when I start to see stories emerging from the material and start to see things that challenge the very things that I know. So here, what are we looking at? We're looking at a tomb, the apex of a tomb. I'm sorry, but I'd rather have sun than this, but we're looking at a tomb, the apex of a tomb dated to the early 15th century in Bidar. Does anybody know where Bidar is?
Yes.
Hyderabad.
Yes, close to Hyderabad. When I first saw this, I was completely shocked that we had material this early in India and of this quality. And when I started to read the poetry in this tomb, I started to realize, wow, this is an incredibly smart poem. There were puns on words such as the word I, Ain in Arabic, or Aine, which means mirror in Persian. There was all this sort of smart material coming together to create this immersive space. But also, there were things about the site, such as the palette, such as the format, all of these things that made it explicitly Indic. So what did this do for me? This gave me sort of a sense of space and place in 15th century India. And the 15th century was a really interesting time. There was a number of sort of transcultural interactions. Sussan just said, you know, there's a big idea out there about high Persianate culture that linked these three empires. However, what we see here is actually a vernacular text in Hindavi, illustrated in a mid-16th century manuscript, which sort of shows you that there are other ways of thinking about culture at this time. This is the Chandayan that was written in 1379. This is a manuscript from central India at the John Rylands Museum. And here we have another manuscript from the British Library. This is a manuscript from Jaipur. So what is all of this material? This is all sort of 15th century material. This is not Mughal material, is it? There's an assumption in South Asia, in sort of Islamic art of South Asia, that all Islamic art of South Asia is Mughal. However, there is a lot of material, actually a lot more material, I would say, that dates from before the Mughals. And if you look at what's happening in India today, there are roads being renamed, there are cities being renamed, and every time something comes as a target, it's a Mughal thing. So you have the destruction of the Babaie Masjid. However, a lot of the material that lingers is Sultanate material,
which has vanished from the popular memory. And
yeah,
people
exactly.
think a lot of people think Babur brought Islam to India. Yeah,
exactly. So what I do is I look for these stories. So here, what are we looking at? We're looking at a shrine in the town of Gwalior that was dedicated to Muhammad Ghost Gwaliori. I'm sure none of you know who Muhammad Ghost Gwaliori is, but he was a very, very important Sufi saint who was a patron of Hindavi and not only Persianate culture, but Hindavi and local poetry. And he inspired treatises on yoga and a lot of other things that were quite interesting for his time. So what do? I look at material that sort of sheds light on how Islamic culture changed when it came to South Asia. So here we're looking at 3 illustrations of different types of planetary deities. In the center, we're looking at Saturn. On the right, we're also looking at Saturn. And on the left, we're looking at a very related type of deity from the Chester Bidi Nujum Lalum, which is a fabulous manuscript. And here we have Kali, and we see how these sort of ideas of the Persianate sort of become in question. They're put in question when you're looking at material from Islamic South Asia. And here we have yet another illustration, a fabulous illustration from Chandigarh of a Kali image that relates directly to these images of Saturn. So, one more. However, the status of Islamic sites in South Asia is really quite sad today. This is a tomb. This is from a city called Chanderi in central India that is falling to disrepair, and actually there's a large movement within circles in India to sort of reclaim Islamic culture and to sort of promote ethos of democracy and all of the things. So. So that's all I have for you. It's a bit of a show and tell.
I'm up next, and we'll be talking about a show that I did with Yuta Kashama, who I think is in the audience at the back, in New York a few years ago. Just as there's often an assumption that there's no art before the Mughals in India, there's often an assumption that art ended with Aurangzeb, who famously disapproved of images, though in fact there are a suspiciously large number of images of Aurangzeb which instantly disprove this notion that iconoclasm was suddenly let loose on South Asia. What we tried to show was that, in fact, some of the greatest painting to come out of South Asia happened after Aurangzeb. And this is a period when the Red Fort is the center of, in many ways, the center of the civilized world. This was an empire which stretched not only through modern India, but Pakistan, Bangladesh, half of Afghanistan. And from the Lahore Gate of the Red Fort, this spectacular vista, there was this extraordinary empire stretching out, the richest empire in the world. So strong, for example, were Indian textile exports that the entire, long before the British arrived in any military sense in South Asia, Indian textiles had already destroyed the Mexican textile industry by the sheer number of exports going to Mexico in the 17th century. So Aurangzeb is supposed to have closed down the imperial atelier. Certainly it's true that patronage lessened, but it revived very quickly under Muhammad Shah Rangila, known as the Colourful. And all you can see in this slightly distorted picture, I'm afraid, is very bright colours. But this is everything that would have made great-grandpa Aurangzeb turn in his grave. Not only is the emperor dressed in slightly effeminate peshwas, which was famously, he was a famous cross-dresser in his day, he's also celebrating a Hindu festival, Holi, doing it with presumably courtesans who are playing music, and in the Red Fort. So you have a Hindu, you have a Muslim emperor celebrating a Hindu festival in the center of this Muslim empire, and playing music, which is again allegedly, according to some of our more Sharia-minded friends, forbidden by Islam, and presumably doing it with women of court women, shall we say. Muhammad Shah Rangila, a great aesthete, enjoyed elephant fighting. He even depicted himself in this particularly louche manner, which we'll pass over without any further comment. Under Shah Alam, the emperor who was blinded by the Afghan Ghulam Qadir, there is a new emphasis in Delhi on high culture. No longer did the Mughals represent any sort of political force, but they represented an incredibly powerful cultural force. And even the Marathas, who in popular understanding were the great enemies of the Mughals, come to Delhi to have their legitimacy confirmed by the emperor, as do all the lesser nobles around the country. And the same happens when the British, or rather the East India Company, arrives. This corporation, based not in Downing Street, but in under the Lloyd's building in the City of London. This corporation gobbles up, as the 18th century reaches its end, great chunks of South Asia. But again, they come to the Mughal court, and there, sitting in the front row amid all the peacocks of the Mughal court, is Sir David Ochterlony, a Bostonian. And this is how the Mughal artists portray him at home. He's wearing a sort of Fab India kurta. He's got his dancing with him. This was a man who famously had 13 Indian wives, each of whom had her own elephant, and every evening they'd do a little trip around the Red Fort. He's shown with a eunuch keeping him free from flies, and you can see the outraged Scottish ancestors peering down from the curtain rail, wondering what's happened to Ur Devi after a few years in this nominally Islamic capital. Sir David Ochterlony was known by his Persian titles, and very few people in Rajasthan realize that Nazirabad is actually named after a Bostonian Scot. Nazir-ud-Dawla was his imperial title. He had as his assistant this snotty young fellow who is the young William Fraser, portrayed by Rayburn before he leaves Edinburgh. But look what happens when he arrives in Calcutta. It's all beginning to go badly wrong. It goes worse by the time he gets to Delhi. And here I'm not sure what he's wearing, Rohit Bal or Tarantiliani. The beard's gone awry, and it's getting worse here. Here, another kind of wedding model shoot with William Fraser starring with his hooker, and there we are again. So again, the Mughal court artists, all Muslims, are portraying an incredible variety of subjects. Some are Hindu, Mughal emperors pursuing Hindu festivals. Some are British patrons sitting for these great imperial patrons. And you have in the court diary Ghulam Ali Khan named. He himself describes himself in his own paintings as from the palace. He's from this long line of imperial painters who've probably gone back to the age of Mansour. But here he is working for Farangis. And incidentally, William Fraser himself is married to a Muslim woman and has a variety of children who he has portrayed. Here is his wife in Haryana, here's his brother-in-laws, and here's his son, who is variously known either as Charles Fraser or Jahangir Mirza, depending on who he's dealing with. So we're dealing with a much more complicated world. Again, Ghulam Ali Khan's circle in the Fraser album, painting these extraordinary pictures of sadhus and his own household servants. This is Kala coming out of the fields dressed as he was in his dhoti when he came to join William Fraser's service, and here he is after a shampoo and a haircut and a nice Napoleonic outfit. And they've got a nice, just to muddle everything, you've got a Shavite tiger skin hat with a Shavite crescent just to top the ensemble. We see Muslim artists portraying dancing girls, opium addicts, all sorts of things that are considered unsuitable. Churches. This is St. James's Church. All this, of course, comes to a grisly end after Zafar. Zafar, with his calligraphy, an incredibly benign court, a court of poets. These are Zafar's own poetic notebooks in the British Library behind us. Even if you can't read the Persian, you can get the impression of this poetic mind, couplet after couplet, running down the gutters and into the margins. And Zafar portrayed with his splendid taste in headwear. But all this sadly comes to a horrible end in 1857, and it is ultimately the British colonialists who put paid to this extraordinary efflorescence of sculpture. There's a gallop through late Mughal art in 5 minutes. Over to you, Venetia.
Thank you very much. Do I get a PowerPoint? Yeah. So I'm Venetia Porter. I work at the British Museum, and I want to look at...
Well done. Keep going.
I want to look at something completely different, which is to touch on how in our new Al-Bukhari Foundation Gallery of the Islamic World, we've looked and tried at some of these contentious subjects, like use of figural representation and displaying music and that sort of thing. How have we actually done that in a practical way? And so the first slide is the entrance to our beautiful new gallery, which opened about 6 months ago, funded by the Al-Bukhari Foundation. And for those of you who haven't seen it, it's right in the heart of the British Museum. Our previous gallery, which was absolutely lovely, which had opened in 1989. Sadly, we needed to close that, but we decided to relocate to the heart of the museum. And that actually is terribly important for lots of different reasons. One of them is that we've been able to display a huge amount more stuff in there, but also that we've put the cultures of Islam right in the heart of the British Museum, which is very, very important indeed. And we also had a new vision about this. So the vision was not just Islamic art and not just central Islamic lands, which often is what gets shown in many museums, but really trying to go the full breadth of Islamic world, from West Africa to Southeast Asia, from the 7th century to the present day. So what is Islamic world as far as we're concerned? And that is the material culture of these regions. It's not one thing at all, as actually we've been seeing from the talks up until now. But what we've been able to deploy is a whole range of different kinds of objects, from archaeology to contemporary art. And one of the things we really wanted to highlight was that what joins this whole series of regions is a thread, which is Islam. But that's not to say that it's just Muslims who live live and lived in all of these different regions, really, that make up this world, in inverted commas. And that this world is made up of peoples who have constantly moved about through trade and conquest and pilgrimage and diplomacy and so on. So I'm just going to show you just a very few slides of objects which are really sort of highlighting some of these tricky issues that we all talk about. So the first thing that we confront is there is no figural representation in Islam, which of course we all know is complete nonsense. But that what we have to think about is what is the context of that, and when was it okay and when was it not okay. So some of the earliest objects we have are, I don't know if you can see the slides at all, but right at the top left there is a painted piece of plaster from one of the great early capitals, Samarra, which was the capital of the Abbasids, their second capital. It became a caliphal city from 836 to 892 only. Now, the interesting thing there is that it was perfectly fine to put these beautiful painted plaster pieces. The piece that we have here comes from one of those kinds of panels of dancing girls, holding wine bottles and that sort of thing. But in the mosque in Samarra incidentally is one of the largest archaeological sites in the world, 57 square hectares just north of Baghdad. In the mosque, it was not okay to put figural imagery, and so you'll have painted designs like this, sort of geometric designs. So there was a very clear understanding in early Islam about what was okay and what was not okay. So then one of the cases we have is we call it a new visual culture. It's where we've really tried to explain what are the elements that make up this new visual culture and where is the place of figural representation within that. Now, I've put up a picture, tiny picture here, you won't see it, but it's a drawing from 1843 of the Bamiyan Buddhas, just to remind us that this is actually a very live issue. Now, in the early period, it was again fine to have little sculptures like this, ceramic sculptures, to have tiles in various buildings, but that the situation is actually very complicated. So if you just look at this tile here, which is a tile from Natanz to a building dated to 1307. It has part of a verse from the Quran, and then it has little birds at the top. Now, what is complicated about this and challenges our assumptions really, is that when these tiles were put into the building, there they were with their Quranic inscriptions with the birds. Now, at some point, and we don't know when, because the tiles were dismantled from this building, probably in the late 19th century, and every single one of the birds has had its head broken off. So whether on the tops of this little bit at the top there in relief or inside the tile itself, every single one. And so these tiles have been dispersed to collections all over the world now, in the major museums, and every single one of them, certainly that I've looked at, has this. So this is what we were looking at in our gallery, and we quote in the gallery from Ahmed al-Tusi, the 12th century scholar who not only went to Bamiyan and described the beauty of the Bamiyan figures, but he wrote this treatise on images, and he argues that they could help trigger an emotional and intellectual response. Ibn Rushd, who died in 1198, argued that although human creativity is limited, I'm just reading it, in comparison to God's all-powerful nature, that does not invalidate human attempts at representing God's creation. So it's very important in our new gallery that all of this material is there in the labels so that people can understand these issues. The other thing that Sussan touched on really is it's very important for people to understand the role of the link between the Abrahamic faiths. So we have one case in the gallery which is called Belief and Practice, where you will see things that some people might consider unusual. An Isnic dish with the Virgin and child, a little flask from Safavid or maybe later, Iran, showing the moment when Abraham is prepared to sacrifice his son. Where we have a Torah pointer, which again, it's a Turkmen craftsmanship from the early 20th century, where we have an incense burner with Christian figures. So all of these things were trying to challenge what people know. And then in terms of the arts of the book, we have an area within the gallery where we display works on paper, and we rotate them every 6 months, and in our current rotation is this image from the Seer and Nabi, the story of the life of the Prophet, from Ottoman Turkey in the mid-1550s. And this is a moment which is depicting the Battle of Badr, where you see what has been taking place there, and then you have the Prophet Muhammad. There he is, veiled. Now, in terms of how we describe this in the gallery, we just tell the story. And it's very important to normalize these kinds of images. We don't make a big fanfare about, look at us at the British Museum. We are displaying, a figure of the Prophet Muhammad. He's veiled. We are just putting it in to show the context of where this material fits. And then music, just my last 2 slides. Music is also something we've touched on. So there are people who don't believe that it's okay to have music. So we have a case which has musical instruments and shadow puppets as well. But what we've tried to do in our gallery is to introduce layers of information. We have these little called QR codes, as I'm sure you know, there, and you can actually listen to Cat Stevens, Cat Yusuf Islam, who is Yusuf Cat Stevens. I think he's combined his names now. And it's very, very interesting to hear him talk about how when he became a Muslim, he says we've got a beautiful recording of him. My introduction to Islam was through the Quran. I had no idea about the role music played, and he then takes us on his journey of why he stopped actually playing music, and then why he started up again. And I'm sure all of us who are Cat Stevens fans are absolutely delighted that he has started playing again, and he's playing with Yusundur and all these people. Now, the last slide is really to show the place of contemporary art, because that's something we collect a lot at the British Museum. And this is a work that we commissioned, which is at the end wall of the second gallery. This is Idris Khan, who is a British Muslim artist, very well known now, and we commissioned to do this piece, which is a reflection on a moment during the Hajj pilgrimage. And this is the moment when pilgrims will go and they will pick up stones and they will stone the Jamarat. They will cast out the devils from inside them. And so what Idris Khan was that he created this sense of a stone being thrown at a wall, and it then becomes an explosion of words coming out. And this is what, for those of you who can't see it, this is what he said. And again, you can go to this magical QR code and you can listen to him talking about this. It's beautiful to imagine when a pilgrim releases a stone and it hits the wall, the words and prayers that the stone represents explode into a physical language. So I hope I've been able to show you how some of these things get discussed in our gallery.
I'm going to start with a few questions and then we'll open it up to you guys. We've got about another 15 minutes. To start with, Venetia, a few years ago I did a Channel 4 series on Sufi music, and we recorded in Syria, Turkey, Palestine, Morocco, India, Pakistan, Lebanon. And what we soon realized was that Sufi music, which we had assumed had a clear identity and meant something, actually varied so much in each country and took on chameleon-like the musical shape and form and sound of each country it was in, that in fact there was almost nothing you could say about Sufi music that made it Islamic other than the words. That the actual music itself was the local music onto which had been grafted an Islamic identity and lyrics. How far is that true also of the visual arts, that each area in the Islamic world takes on local colouring, and all that is Islamic about it is actually the message of the Prophet as written in script?
Well, thank you. I mean, that's a very, very important question. I mean, local colouring, absolutely, and I think there are huge issues about calling it Islamic in the first place. Of course, but you know, we're lumbered with this.
Obviously, particularly there's this issue that every museum faces internationally. Where do you put the Mughal stuff? Is it in Islamic or is it in South Asia? Often it leads to both groups falling out with each other over acquisitions.
Well, we do.
That's certainly the case of the Met, I know.
Well, we don't. We all love each other at the British Museum, so that's all completely fine. And actually, the way that we've got around this in terms of the Indian Islamic material, because it's not just Mughal, of course, is that it's in both galleries. It's in the our new Islamic gallery, but it's also in in the newly refurbished Hotum Gallery, where you see the cultures of South Asia, and previously we didn't show Islam there, so now we do that. But I think it is important to recognise that this isn't one thing, as I mentioned at the beginning, that actually you have Iranian Islamic art, if you like, which has a completely different kind of nature to Arab art of the same period. So I would say that like the music, that it changes wherever it goes. I mean, you only have to look at at architecture in India, for example, to see this incredible
you
blend.
were making, Sussan.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
exactly.
Actually, I wanted to add to what Venetia was saying by saying that this is not about, Islam is not writing a manual for people to make art. It's not about teaching the faith. It's not unlike Christianity or Buddhism, where you have a Buddhist art or a Christian art. Islamic art is not about teaching the faith. Therefore, it doesn't have that role to play. Rather, it's an attitude, it's a particular posture, it's a particular approach to thinking about the world we occupy. How do we relate to the created world? How do we depict this, historically speaking? And in each instance, you have to look at it within its own context. So the name Islamic is not meant to be about the religion guiding it. And it's more than writing, actually. So you can distinguish what is Islamic art of South Asia from the Arab world, let's say Syria, from Iran, from Mali, and so forth, on the basis of how they look at it. But it's not about a manual of art. It's not about teaching of the faith through the visual material.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would love to add to that. So one of the types of manuscripts that I work on are cosmographies, and these are wonderful sort of encyclopedias of the entire universe and world, and they show wonders. And every type of cosmography, whether it's produced in Ottoman Turkey or Sultanate India or Iran, they give you visions into how people at the time during the 15th century through the 19th century imagine their world. And it's really fascinating because these genres and these things, maybe the text is the same, but there are ways in which images shift, there are ways in which things are reinterpreted, there are ways in which, it's actually an immense opportunity for knowledge to circulate from as far as China to Morocco. It's a wonderful thing, really. And once you start thinking of it in terms of knowledge rather than pure faith and practice and these sort of very strict guidelines, you have an immense opportunity for interpretation and how different things are interpreted in different places.
I'd just like to say that one of the things I give my students to do is take a water bottle and say, look at the object in the world and look at the world in the object. And I think that kind of helps to think about how we imagine every time we take something, a piece of architecture. There are many worlds in that object, and that object is in many worlds. And where it moves and how it shifts and how it's shaped by that oftentimes gives us a way to rethink those objects in different ways. And I think that's a really important thing with any object that you take, any piece of aesthetic experience, whether it's music or architecture. And these terms, if I may say, I mean, they are an inheritance of a colonial mindset in many ways. I mean, I don't need to keep on saying that, but it is true. This kind of categorization into Islamic, into Christian, into Buddhist, we are in a sense living in that kind of, still living with those labels, which may or may not have meant anything to the people who initially created these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To move on to the whole question of figurative and non-figurative, we've seen in the examples a huge variety of different figurative objects across many different Islamic cultures. But are there any examples of figurative depictions other than accidentally in for things like the Qutb Mosque, where figures are left from previous temples? Are there any conscious examples of figurative art within Islamic sacred spaces and mosques?
The only example that I can think of, and maybe Venetia and Sussan might, or Vivek might know others, but in Oman, you have Chinese blue and white bowls set into mihrabs, and many of them have birds, right? So that's one example that I have, seen, and it's quite. Especially in mosques, I think predating the 16th century. In that period, there seems to have been, and besides, this is an Ibadi Muslim context, different from the Sunni and Shia traditions. So that might be one example where I've seen that quite strikingly. I'm not sure if you can think of others.
I actually can think of the potential in finding such things in tombs, in fact, in mausolea, where having birds and trees and so forth as part of a kind of a wished for paradise.
The human figure?
No.
And that's very straight throughout Islamic world.
Well, except that this kind of moment that you have, in the pottery of Kashan, where you have some of these.
But it's a sacred site.
It's a sacred site, but it's figural. So it's more than just like the tile that I showed with the birds. You know, you have these. There seems to be a sort of moment in 12th, 13th century.
Fit? And in a sacred site.
They fit in the sacred site.
Yeah, I would also say, to your point about the Qutb, there's so many mosques in South Asia from the medieval period that are made of reused material, right?
Yep.
And spolia from temples, or even material that's made to look like it's antique. However, it's staged in a particular way to evoke spolia. So I would say it's not necessarily fair to say, oh, well, those are broken, therefore they're not figures. I mean, yes, within prescribed traditions, if the figure cannot breathe, if it cannot have life, then it is not alive and therefore cannot be worshipped as an idol. So there are ways in which this debate, which is a very big debate within our field today, and many, many scholars are writing about it, is developing. But it's definitely an interesting question.
And then you get the very complicated Islamic response to non-Islamic figures. So, for example, possibly the most famous site of sculpture of Hindu and Buddhist Hindu sculpture in India is the Ellora Caves.
Yeah.
Now, the Ellora Caves lie only 5 miles away from Dalrymple, which was the Islamic capital of the Deccan for 400 years.
Exactly.
And the home of many people who are considered to be the greatest iconoclasts. And yet there is not a single image, as far as I've seen, in Ellora which has been deliberately defaced.
And in fact, at the beginning of the 17th century, one of the most important histories of the court of Bijapur describes Ellora, the caves of Ellora, in detail, and includes these descriptions of Ellora in a section on wonders. So Ellora and these caves and these things become and take on other lives. Even the Buddhas.
They're not seen as living temples.
Even the Buddhas of Bamiyan, for instance, are considered wonders within the cosmographical tradition, at least.
Yeah, you get that? Sorry, I realized I forgot.
We're live.
This thing.
Yeah, we're live. We're
okay. That reminds me actually of Ibn Jubayr, the great traveller, who went through Egypt. And he, because he was going on Hajj, and he had to go that way through Upper Egypt, and he marvels and describes the figural scenes that he sees on these great temples and the writings and all that. And there isn't, certainly in the writings that I know of, where a moment where he's saying actually this is haram. He's actually seeing, he's got that sense of wonder that you're talking about there.
I'm sorry, could I just say that
Zulfikar.
I think the very question is actually from a rather Eurocentric perspective.
Yes.
That we are asking whether this is an issue in Islam and in Islamic practices is because we are accustomed to images from European arts in the churches and so forth. And of course, in a South Asian context with the temples and so forth.
It's a very live issue there, yeah.
Well, it is, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Islam somehow has to answer this question. And I think that is a real issue that we keep harping on this. It is an important issue. There are, as Vivek said, a number of scholars working on this subject, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at the forefront of our thinking. Rather, perhaps, thinking should digress towards how the human figure might be treated in Islam.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to use the term, there's a certain sense of Islamic exceptionalism going on here,
Right.
where somehow Islam is exceptional in this respect. And we know that both Christianity and Judaism have had moments of iconoclasm and have been iconoclasts. So it's not something that is exceptional to Islam and should not be discussed that way.
The same key texts of the Old Testament, and
Yeah,
Sinai
exactly.
and the golden cow.
Absolutely, and I think that there is this sense of exceptionalism which should be countered. But I think it's also what you said, and I think this is important, that I think it's refusing the question is actually part of thinking through what the question should be.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we are both responding to a Western European paradigm, but also a certain group of Muslims who have positioned this in a very loud voice, in a way which we cannot get away from the fact that there are some Muslims who do think that this should be that, but not all Muslims, in fact, probably the vast majority, and historically so, have not thought this way.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree with Sussan more, actually. And to pick up on something that Zulfikar said, it's how you use the material to tell stories. It's really what you do when you encounter this material. So, one of the tombs that I visited, that I showed, was a tomb that, maybe it might be couched within a history of Mughal art. But what do we do when we sort of scratch the surface and start to look at who that tomb was donated to, what his status was, and we start to tell other stories that might lead us into directions that are not these debates on the bild verboten or the prohibition against images or other things that might be part of an intellectual zeitgeist of today. So
We have time, I think, for one or two questions. That gentleman had his hand straight up, energetically, with the grey hair. Sorry, sir. You're next.
You asked.
No, he's first, behind you.
You asked about figurative representation in a sacred context. The one example I can think of is that the Prophet himself, after the conquest of Mecca, insisted that the pre-existing icon of Jesus and Mary remain in the Kaaba.
That's right.
Also, on the other hand, there have been extreme versions where figurative representations were haram, even in the case of reproducing vegetables or flowers. For example, a daisy, which has been geometricized in the very, very famous Moorish pattern. That is, in fact, a geometric version of a daisy. But the question I also wanted to ask you is, in the case of the Kashan tile that you showed me, I wonder whether it might be true that the Shias were much more amenable to the idea than the Sunnis might have been about representation of animals.
Yes, I mean, that's certainly, there seems to be this moment with these that you find in Shia shrines. Sorry, shall I just answer? That you find in Shia shrines where you do seem to have a lot of these figurative designs. I don't think they're people. I'm trying to remember. I think they're all animals.
Yeah.
But you have some of these with. Some of them have verses from the Quran around them. Some of them have Shahnameh around them. So there does seem to be a great fluidity. But from my understanding, this is a kind of moment in time that is quite unusual. Whether it's a Shia thing
It's
as well.
not a
People
Shia
talk about.
thing, actually.
I don't know.
That's the question is that this has always been the issue, that Shiites are more tolerant of images, figural images, than Sunnis are. That's not at all true, for the very fact that in the 14th century, 15th century, 13th century, we are dealing with Sunni communities, not Shiite communities.
Yeah, exactly.
Shiism becomes dominant in the
Much later.
16th century onwards. So before that, it depends on the cultural scene, I think. So you can think about the traditions prior to Islam. How do they survive? How far do they go? So the eastern parts of the Islamic world in general, so Iran, Central Asia, Afghanistan, South Asia, tend to preserve those traditions of the past and rethink them and revive them through the Islamic histories. And that is primarily not a matter of Shiite or Sunni, actually.
Two very last quick questions in the front here. Sir, and then Madam.
About the images in the mosque, etc. I come from Bangladesh, and I was studying how the Muslims came to East Bengal, how all of a sudden in one place Islam came. In that connection, I saw some pictures in a book in the British Library. I took pictures of that. And the mosque, which was a very rudimentary mosque, in the doors, one door I see a picture of a Al-Aqsa Mosque dome, and other door is a Kali, picture of Kali. And then
in a mosque?
In the mosque, a rudimentary mosque, which maybe in any season gone. But Ibn Battuta came to Sylhet.
Thank you, sir. And if we could quickly have the lady next to you.
Yeah.
I think, having heard the discussion this afternoon, thank you very much, all of you, for your points of view. I think it is time now to break the box and stop discussing only figural images and talk of Islam as it is, talk of Christianity as it is, talk of Hinduism as it is, and talk of Judaism as it is. For some, in the pictures that Venetia showed us, we have boxed Islam into the Al-Bukhari, I happen to be a Bukhari, into the Al-Bukhari gallery, for which millions were paid, and nobody goes further than that. Now, can we stop thinking of figural images and talk of Islam as as a concept, as a thought process, far wider?
Yeah.
Could we just answer that, and then we'll...
I just want to just answer that. The reason why we have done that is for the visitor. So visitors come with these assumptions. And our role as a museum is to actually contextualize and explain. So that's why we've done that. And I have to say that one of the things is that when we opened the gallery, I remember a journalist coming up to me and saying, but there are so many images in this gallery. Have you deliberately put lots of images in this gallery? This was a question from a journalist. And I said, no, we are telling the story as it is, but it's important for the public to actually understand these issues. And I think that's all we've done there.
I'm afraid we've now run out of time. We can continue this discussion, however, at the book signing tent, where if you buy a nice book of any of us, you'll be allowed to ask as many questions as you like. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Brilliant.
Session was sponsored by Institute of Islamic Studies and Aga Khan Foundation. Thank you very much.